Hello and welcome to the Game Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Veseley. We are presented by The Athletic. Today on the show, Adam Spinella is in the building. He's waving. He's happy to be here. Adam and I have a really fun episode scheduled today. We're going to dive deep into why NBA prospects can sometimes struggle to live up to the expectation heaped upon them when they get drafted early in their respective draft classes. And this is a really fun idea, right? I want to shout out the Twitter user that gave us this idea later on. I want to shout out a number of things. But first, Adam, what's going on, buddy?
Hey, Sam. Happy Sunday night here in the United States, or Monday morning your time. Doing great. Everything is good on our end here. Had a good weekend. Got to see Barbie. So, like, doing some actual life things in August, because apparently that's what you're supposed to do a little bit, is not just watch Synergy for 18 hours a day. So trying that on for size. And, so far so good.
No, like you're tweeting out clips of Hansen Yang from U19. Like we need to restrict Synergy access for you for like a week, maybe. Like I might get like, someone over at Synergy, like Matt Curley, to be like, no, like you please lock Adam out of Synergy for a week. Like that's it.
They've tried before. They've never been able to fully keep me out. I've got like 3 burner accounts on Synergy and other people's who I can borrow. So like this, I love where your head's at. It's not going to work.
Oh no. By the way, Hansen Yang, fun player at the U19 this year for China. Like really fun player. Actually, I am like actually genuinely intrigued with him as a prospect. He is someone that like seems to have that skill where he has extra time that the other players don't, right? Whatever it is in his brain where he's able to like slow things down in his mind. Every time he has the ball, it feels like he has an extra split second to make decisions that other players don't have. And that's a really impressive skill to have, I think.
Yeah, a million things to clean up and continue to improve to become a professional basketball player or an NBA guy. But at first glance, like his feel is off the charts for a 7-footer. I'm intrigued.
Truly. No, truly like off the charts.
Yeah.
He is like I think he is a genuine player for NBA teams to track. Hansen Yang, like no question. Okay. Lawrence Field, did you listen to Down to Dunk this week? Because apparently there's some sort of simulation that Down to Dunk did that Lawrence Field is asking about in the YouTube comments. I've not done expansion draft or Down to Dunk, although that is not a bad idea, and I might steal that idea from Andrew at some point where we do that. No, this episode is going to be based upon an idea sent to us by user Alex Eddy over on Twitter. Shout out to Alex, longtime listener, going back to the Coles Wicker, Kurtenbach days of the show. I want to talk about this idea of, and I'll say exactly what the tweet was that gave us this plan. It was, let's see here. Where did I get it? Keep crushing the summer content. Was curious if you could do an episode on why certain guys didn't make it, haven't made it yet. Did it have to do with fit, evaluation, something else? Examples that we'll get into later on. And I thought this was such a good idea to dive into for like a summer episode, not only in terms of trying to make us get better at our jobs as evaluators, trying to think a little bit more critically about why players don't work out in the NBA, but also in terms of listeners and trying to maybe explain maybe why someone didn't work out, maybe some of the different factors that can go into a player not working out as it refers to the NBA.
I love this idea. And I think you hit the nail on the head. This needs to be framed from how can we as talent evaluators and scouts improve? And how can we as fans and consumers of the product continue to increase our understanding of the game of basketball? It's not just about looking at these guys and trying to pick apart where their careers went wrong. Like every time you give constructive feedback or you analyze somebody and you look at either the negatives, the improvement areas, the things that went wrong, you need to try to take a positive from it, something for us to learn, something for them to continue to improve at. And I just hope that we as we listen to this conversation, myself, you, or anyone else out there, keep that in mind.
Yeah, and here's a word that I don't want to use. I don't want to use the word bust throughout this conversation. It was funny. I was listening to, I think, a Pistons podcast had Stanley Johnson on to talk about what do you say when people call you a bust? And honestly, like that conversation and that kind of discussion that, Stanley Johnson was very thoughtful about kind of made me comfortable talking about this, even though we're not going to use the word bust when we talk about these players, because he was very thoughtful, like in the way that he says, like, you know what, I don't think of myself as a bust. Like I had a number of things that happened basically right as soon as I got into the NBA. I believe that he referenced his mother passing away and him getting to camp late because of it. And, the trickle down effect of everything that happened through that. And then like an injury occurs and, just the different contextual factors that can lead to someone maybe not living up to the expectation that is heaped upon them. And I think ultimately these draft selections end up resulting in a world where expectation is heaped upon players in a real substantial way. And I just want to be a little bit more thoughtful about the way that we go about this conversation. And one way that I want to do it is by starting with this idea. I think that there is this, and I think that this is maybe where it all stems from in many ways in terms of why a player doesn't live up to expectation. There are precious few rookies. There are probably 5 to 7 rookies every decade that come into the NBA and are genuine great players in the NBA. Luka Doncic stands out. It's probably less than 7, to be honest. You might be able to convince me it's 5. There are very few players that come into the NBA from the jump and are elite level players and are ready to go. Like I would say, honestly, Evan Mobley being an all defense guy from day one, that is exceedingly rare. So every single time that a player enters the NBA, that player has to get better in order to keep up or in order to showcase his worth in the NBA or just to essentially be in the NBA at all and stick in the NBA and establish your place in the hierarchy in the NBA. So one thing that I feel like I often hear from people is, oh, like X player, he didn't get better. Oh, he just never got better. He stagnated by the time he got to college. He just completely, just there's no point where he ever improved his skill set, right? And that's just like so categorically wrong. Like,
yeah.
It's not that players don't get better when they get to the NBA. It's that they may not improve at the rate of other players, or they don't improve at the rate of the guys around them in the NBA who are also competing and all trying to get better and all trying to improve. And by the time you reach a certain veteran status at that point, your work ethic is incredibly good. You know how you have to go about improving. You get slotted into a great role that you know how to work within the construct of the team that you play for, or within a number of other teams that you can go play for at some point. And that allows you to hone a specific skill set that works for you. But at the end of the day, these guys all get better. Like Anthony Bennett, I would bet you right now, is a drastically better basketball player than he was in his first year with the Cleveland Cavaliers, despite the fact that Anthony Bennett is not playing in the NBA. A number of NBA slots, let's say, maybe 2 to 3 per team, something like 90 spots per year in the NBA. More than that, including two-way contracts, but let's say guaranteed contracts, maybe 90 to 110 slots play in the NBA. They are given contracts based on what they will be, not what they are currently, because the upside of what they will at some point be great. It's just that you have to keep improving to do that. And your rate of improvement has to keep up and has to keep going at a level commensurate with NBA status and NBA skill sets, right?
Yep.
It's not that guys don't get better. It's that they don't get better at the same rate that other NBA players do. And there are a number of reasons why that can happen, but I want to start there and I'll let you talk now because I think I've just laid this out for 4 minutes. I think that this is the most important place to start for me, in my opinion.
I like that. And I think it's important to note that everybody does improve, but it's also important to note that development is never linear, that it's not a year one, you get better at this and you take another incremental step forward, year two, then year three, then year four. And now it's contract decision time. And we'll decide if we want to keep this player or move on. Development does not work in that way. There are ledges that you jump on or down, peaks and valleys throughout this conversation that you have to be aware of. But the other part of this, you mentioned that everybody gets better at something. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that you've got to get better at the right things in order to stick in the NBA. So, I don't want to jump too far ahead of the conversation here, but there's only one basketball on a court at a time. And it tends to be a little bit of an adjustment to try to figure out how to find your role and your voice when you might be sacrificing some touches, being asked to do things for the benefit of the team that you have never done before. So the adaptability that players show when they get into the league to not just accept that role, but then excel at it on the court is really an important factor in this.
Yeah. So I kind of want to jump into the ways that I think this can be a problem first. Ways that guys can end up not continuing to grow at a level that is marginally better than the other players around them within an extremely competitive NBA. Because that's the thing. Everybody around you is trying to get better. Everybody around you is honing their craft in some way. Everybody around you is trying to take your spot. The 750 guys in Europe in college next year, the 60 draft slots in college next year that exist, the now 92 way spots that exist. They're all trying to take your spot as well. So the key to me is improving at a rate beyond what they are improving at. So what are some of the reasons why, maybe you don't improve at that rate? I just want to throw out the top 3 things here that absolutely occur just contextually that maybe we don't see.
Sure.
Or maybe we do. Injury, work ethic, or off-court issues that will stop your work ethic, right? I don't think we need to dive into injury necessarily. I think that is just something that can occur. Just know also, I think that a lot of the time, NBA fans don't know about all of the injuries that are occurring that can stop somebody from working out, for 3 weeks here and there in the off season. There's just no reason to report that. Right. So I think it's really, really important to note that injuries are not just the ones that you hear about, but sometimes they're the ones that you don't hear about that keep a guy off the court for 3 months in the off season or 2 weeks in the off season or whatever it is. Right. Work ethic is obvious. Sometimes you have to evaluate work ethic. That's the reality. Completely 100% a real thing. Again, don't need to dive into that. I think it's pretty obvious. Off-court issues that can stop you from getting in the gym and, doing things and being the kind of person you need to be. Again, we'll talk about some examples with that. I think one is abundantly obvious. We will talk about that momentarily here.
And Sam, I'll just throw out a couple coachisms that kind of wrap this up because these phrases are abundant within the profession that I work in. And I think for any younger guys who are still playing and trying to pursue their dreams of basketball, they're important messages to hear, right? One is the best ability is availability. I think we hear that all the time, but it's not just, hey, are you on the bench during the game when coach can call you to sub you in? It's being in the gym frequently. It's avoiding those distractions or those areas off court that are going to pull you away from getting better at your craft, as you just mentioned. And I think the second aspect of this is what I always say: coaches and people who are trying to help you get better, you're in the business of eliminating excuses. You need to find ways to tune out all of that stuff that's going on outside that's within your control and focus on getting better the best that you can. And sometimes that's character eval that you can go through during the pre-draft scouting process. Other times there's just life that happens. And sometimes that is outside of everybody's control. But at the end of the day, you want to have guys who are available, keep working, and eliminate all the excuses to make sure that this is their craft and they want to keep getting better at it.
In terms of the things that are developmental, that I think sometimes can be reasons for not improving at the rate of your peers, right? Sometimes your body just maxes out a little bit quicker than other players do, right? Again, development is not linear. Physical growth is not linear, right? There are guys that you look at when they are 15 years old. You know, everybody gets a little bit bigger from the time they're 15, but there are guys that are 17 that don't get much bigger than what they were when they were 17, right?
Yep.
And, you know, we'll talk about specific examples where that happened, obviously. I think that one, to me, that stands out in that regard is Stanley Johnson, right? Stanley Johnson was a brick shithouse from the time he was 16 years old and just dominated in a real way. And, you know, we just talked about Stanley Johnson at the top, and that's, you know, he didn't have any more room to grow in his frame. So he had to improve in other ways. And unfortunately, seemingly other things stopped him from doing that. Sometimes your skill set is just kind of maxed out, right? You know, maybe you don't have as much to grow athletically as other players, and you're a little bit of an older player, and your skill set, you know, from a shooting perspective, you've maxed out your shooting, and then you just don't have, you know, the shiftiness in your hips. You don't have this, you don't have that. You don't have the ways to get better in the ways that you can. Speaking of that, like athletic limitations, certainly, right? There are athletic limitations that sometimes just stop you from getting better comparatively to other NBA guys, right? If you are somebody that has kind of stiffer hips, I think you're going to have a little bit of a tougher time going against the kind of fluid athletes that the NBA has throughout its ranks. It's just going to be really hard for you. If you aren't wildly explosive and you're going up against a league of 400 of the best athletes in the league, that's going to be a problem for you sometimes. And there are ways to go around it from a skill set perspective, but sometimes you just max out, right?
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up adjustment to an off-ball role. From the time that many lottery picks are 12 years old, 10 years old, right, a lot of the time, they are given the ball because they're the best player. They're the best player on their team, right? Of course, you're going to be given the ball if you're the best player. Think about competitive basketball. You want to give the ball to the best guy on your team in order to win games. Adam's a high school coach. He will tell you, hey, I love coaching off-ball guys. Like, I love having guys that can move without the ball. But at the end of the day, we got to get the ball in the hands of our best dudes. And when you have 450 guys in the league that are not only the best guy on their high school team, but the best guy on their college team, most of the time, probably the best player in their college conference, frankly, then you need to be able to adjust into more of an off-ball role. The examples I always give here are Tony Allen and PJ Tucker. Both of these guys won Big 12 Player of the Year because of how good they were on offense, not because of how great they were on defense. Like, both were great on defense, don't get me wrong, but you don't win Big 12 Player of the Year at 6'5" if you are not an incredible offensive player. And then they get to the NBA and they have to adjust into an off-ball role. Both guys do it tremendously, right? But that adjustment doesn't work for everybody. Rashad Vaughn, I think, is a great example of this. Guy that had the ball in his hands all throughout his life, struggled to adjust to that off-ball role and didn't really know how to play without the ball at that point. So that adjustment, I think, can be a little bit harder for people than what I think is often recognized, maybe.
And Sam, I want to go back to
Yeah.
that at the end if we can, because that's a point. I'm writing all these down now, so if it looks like I'm distracted off screen, I'm not. I'm writing all these down for future reference here. But I want to come back to this at the end and talk about kind of the future of prospect development and some trends that we see at the youth and grassroots level that will show up in prospects in 3, 5, 10 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Do you have any strong, maybe we'll continue.
Sure.
Maybe we'll continue. I think it'll be easier when we start to get into examples.
Yep.
Another thing that I think is really important that I've started to value more is sometimes having a lack of experience at the highest levels of play and the speed of the game and the adjustments you have to make when things are flying at you high speed. Like Kyle Mann just posted one of the funniest clips of Bob McKillop like dancing and like giving a speech that I've seen in a long time. But one of the things he's talking about is like absurd. He believes that all of the best guards come from cities because you develop kind of your spatial awareness and your reactions, like just walking around in cities, basically. How much I believe that, I don't know. Yeah. It feels like a coachism on some level, right? Mm-hmm. But one thing that I think is important is playing a lot of high leverage basketball minutes, getting on a court, playing against dudes, understanding what's coming at you, and not just relying on tools in some way, not just relying on what somebody has and what they could be long term, but actually seeing how those tools bear itself out. And from the player perspective, understanding what is coming at you, how to process that information, and then give an output, right? Make a decision. Can you do that at a rapid speed? I think guys that lose some of that experience early on can really struggle to get it back once you get to the NBA. Sometimes it's due to skipping levels. Sometimes I think that one thing that will be important that we talk about this year is, for instance, with like Elliot Cadeau this year, is I have a very strong opinion that point guards should never reclassify. I think it's a really bad idea in general for point guards to reclassify, because I think getting those reps and getting those experiences, oftentimes of just being better than everybody. I know the idea of why people think it's a good idea for point guards to reclassify, because you're getting against better competition. You're seeing things fly at you. I think that like to be a point guard in the NBA, you have to be really fucking good, especially if you're a smaller, undersized point guard, and getting reps where you are the best player on the court and where you can like just consistently, not just, like Elliot Cadeau average, 15 points and play in the NIBC and like be incredible and dish out passes at a really high level and be the kind of player that I really like Elliot Cadeau's talent level. But I think it's really worthwhile to be able to actually get into those settings and dominate on some level, because that's what you have to do in the NBA. Like even like somebody like Jeff Teague, right? Like Jeff Teague has to dominate the ball and he has to average 17 points and 7 rebounds. And by the time he gets to Wake Forest, like he has to be able to be that floor general at a very real rate and often, and he has to run an offense at a high level. I think that skipping steps and skipping reps in that way is not beneficial to high school point guards, to underage point guards. Like I think that point guards should never reclassify is my take. And I have examples back through history from Derek Thornton to like, frankly, Tyrese Proctor last year, I think is a great example of the fact that he really struggled early in his freshman season because I think the adjustment was enormous, essentially skipping a level and reclassifying into that class. Ashton Hagans is another example of a guy that, it wasn't a underage guy in terms of age, but skipped the last year of his high school career when he really could have gone through it and tried to be great. Like, you can go back through all of these big time 5-star reclassifications. Scotty Wilbekin gets to Florida at 16. It takes him like 3 years to be good at basketball in college. Like there are so many examples of this
Well,
where I
and
think that trying to skip steps is a bad idea as a point guard.
Well, and two other things with that. One, it's not just point guards either, right? Like we've seen James Wiseman struggle to make that leap essentially from high school to the NBA without having those reps in large volume at Memphis and then going through a bunch of injuries. Like it's hard to reclaim the time that you miss for whatever reason you miss it, whether it's injury and absence or just trying to skip that level. Like reps are really important. The second piece of that, it should make us really value teenagers who are playing well, particularly against professional competition at a young age, even more than we maybe already have. Like I still look back at what Luka Doncic did before coming into the NBA, and I don't know how we can overlook something like that ever again.
Yeah, I mean, multiple others like Christian Lander at Indiana is another good example. I thought Kylan Boswell struggled at times last year. I don't know. I like Kylan as a player, and I'm like excited to see what he looks like at Arizona. And I'm imagining he's probably going to start this year, but I'm interested to see what he looks like. And there's some weird circumstances, if I remember correctly, there. Like Devin Askew was like a 5-star point guard that skipped steps and decided to come forward and is in a weird spot. I think that a lack of experience by the time that you get to the NBA is very hard to, or like missing reps in that way is very hard to overcome a lot of the time, because that adjustment to that speed and that athleticism and literally the best players on the world is exceptionally hard. It's exceptionally hard to overcome. Let's see here. Do I have other things? Sometimes you're just older than other guys. Like truly, like age does matter. Like I think I tend to be somebody that is a little bit probably more ambivalent than most draft evaluators to age, but sometimes you are maxed out.
Yeah.
Like that is a reality. I think the key is if you're going to draft players that are a little bit older, they need to be on a steep upward trajectory still. Keegan Murray was on a continual steep upward trajectory. Desmond Bane was on a continual steep upward trajectory for many years. I think that if you're going to draft older in the lottery in the top 20, you need to be on that kind of trajectory.
Sure. If I could rephrase kind of those 2 points, right? The younger guys as well as these older guys who are on that trajectory, it's really starting your professional clock at the right time, whether that's guesswork on your end, it's advice that you get from those in your circle around you, or just having the innate feel of knowing when you should be going to the NBA. The guys who don't wait too long or don't come out too early are the ones that are always going to be best set up to succeed and maximize the time on that first contract to get minutes to help an NBA team and prove that they belong in the league for a little bit longer. Mr. Muted over there.
Yes, I was.
There he is.
The next kind of group of things that I want to talk about are things that are outside of a player's control. Maybe just never finding the right fit, right?
Yep.
I think that sometimes that does happen. Sometimes players just don't find the right spot for their skill set at the end of the day that really works. And, you know, that's hard, right? Like that can be really hard. And it can be a tough pill to swallow, I think, for players that feel like they didn't get their chance to thrive. But I do think it happens. I think that sometimes, you know, it'll feed into one thing that we'll talk about later. I think sometimes GMs just kind of misevaluate a skill set and players get placed into roles that may not be best for them. And that can be a problem. Another one is just front office turnover in that regard, right?
Yep.
Sometimes you get to a front office. Every year, some front office is on the chopping block or is on the hot seat, quote unquote. But that doesn't stop them from making draft picks, right? They still have to make the pick of the guy that they think is best. And that's something that's completely out of a player's control. Whether or not you end up or land in that situation is really, you know, something you can only control the things you can control, I think, as a player oftentimes. And that's unfortunately something they can't control. And if you get drafted to a front office that gets fired, maybe that front office is not nearly as connected to you. Maybe that lead executive is coming from a front office that did not have a high draft grade on you. Sometimes those can be wrong, right?
Well, it's human nature too. I mean, if they're going to fire a guy, whether it's a coach or a front office executive, chances are pretty good that they're going to want to bring in somebody who thinks about the game and roster construction a little bit differently. So if that's the case, then a younger player who is envisioned to be in a certain realm is probably not going to have the same opportunity under the new regime.
Yeah, like the guy that I always bring up in this regard is like David Lighty at Ohio State. Like, 35-year-old guy now, came out of Ohio State a little bit older because he suffered some injuries early in college. But, sometimes, the right circumstances just never come up. You go to summer league and you don't shoot well in the 2-game sample that you get to prove yourself, right? But you look at what David Lighty has done in France. He's a 5-time French league champion, having played for Osvel. He's a 2-time French league finals MVP, 2-time French league all-star. He's been phenomenal in that league for years upon years upon years. And I think that he could be genuinely, I think he could have been in his prime, an NBA rotation player. He just didn't get the right opportunity at the right time to do that. And sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes you just never find that. You never find the right thing at the right time, right?
Yeah. And my eyes are on Usman Garuba right now for that exact same reason.
Exactly. I think Usman can really play, but we'll see whether or not he finds the right fit, right? And the last thing I want to talk about here is just misevaluation, right? Okay. Players miss, or front office people miss. It happens. And we're going to talk about a great example of that early in this conversation. Sometimes we're wrong as evaluators. Sometimes people who work in front offices are wrong. Sometimes the pre-draft rankings and where teams have you ranked and where that can just happen. And we need to acknowledge it. And that's not a fault of the player. That's just heaped expectations upon what a player can be. And, sometimes it's an informed bet for what a player isn't right now, but what he can be in the future. I think Kira Lewis stands out in that regard, right? New Orleans, he ticks a number of these boxes, injury and, skipped steps, right? Because he reclassified and played as a non-draft eligible player at Alabama his first year. And then he gets the NBA and ends up missing a full year in the NBA early in his career. So he's behind the 8 ball drastically in terms of the amount of reps that he can have. But the idea behind Kira Lewis was an informed bet of, hey, if this guy's body fills out, he's very productive already. He can shoot. He has incredible speed, right? He can play within ball screens already, but we know that he can't play yet. It's just that down the road, we think he will. That's probably, I think, frankly, it's probably a misevaluation on some level. We'll see if the injury stuff comes back. If he can get all the way back from the injury, I hope that he does. And I hope that he's not just a cautionary tale, but that there are a number of examples of guys who can be misevaluated. And we're going to talk about that throughout the process. And there's one prime example I want to bring up when we talk about that. Sure. But undeniably, that's a real factor here that we need to not ignore as we go through this. Very often evaluators are wrong because they're working within an imperfect, art form, basically.
Yep, no doubt about it. And I think it's worth noting that many of these things can be true simultaneously. I think that if you look at any of the players that we're likely to talk about for the next however long we're doing this, it's probably multiple of these boxes that get checked, not just one of them that is the reason for the downfall. Can I add one more that I've been thinking about a little bit? Evolution of the game.
Yep.
That there are a lot of times trends in the way that basketball is played. It's a copycat league in the NBA. Teams see one formula that is working and oftentimes try to replicate it or build a roster that can beat it. It's very trend driven at the period of time. So I know we'll talk maybe a little bit about some back to the basket big men who maybe have not turned into NBA stars in the way that many of us hoped. Sometimes the trend of where the game of basketball is heading is a little bit outside of their control. Maybe it was, a lack of skill or an injury here or there that influenced things. But how valuable is being a 1.1 point per game, point per possession back to the basket scorer in the modern NBA anymore if you're not a great defender and do all these other things that go with it? So as the game continues to change, we see certain types of players get phased out. And unfortunately, that just means sometimes guys are caught in the middle of that.
Yeah. And, look, at the end of the day, like, I think you need to go to a spot that's going to develop you in the ways of the modern game. And we'll talk about one, I think, early on in this conversation that just did not really get that. But we're going to go from 2015 to 2020, talk about like top 10 picks, basically, that really didn't necessarily live up to the expectation. And we're going to take a quick commercial break, though, and then we will be right back. Okay, Adam, we're back. And we're going to start in 2015. I'm glad you brought up evolution of the game, because I think that 2015 was really at the crux of that in many ways, right? And there's one name that stands out, the guy that went number 3 overall in that draft class. It is Jahlil Okafor.
Yeah.
Jahlil Okafor came along at a time where I think we all hoped that there was still a place for back to the basket bigs who were like incredible post scorers. And then we hoped that I think Jahlil would develop a jumper and that he would be able to move his feet a little bit better on defense. And I think we didn't value as evaluators the ability to move your feet on defense enough, because 2015 in the NBA, 2014, 2015 NBA season is the year where the Golden State Warriors won the title. In 2014, San Antonio Spurs won the title, right? And, they had Tim Duncan. They had these bigs that were, and Tim Duncan's a totally different deal. Tim Duncan's one of the best defenders ever. Nobody's going to confuse Jahlil Okafor for that. But, like, it's hard. I think it's a little bit harder than what you maybe would give it credit for back in 2015 to know that the league was going to go this far this way, right? Okafor had a number of other things, he was speeding, he got hit with a speeding ticket off the court, seemingly made some not ideal decisions. Maybe there are a number of different, I think that like he probably ticks a number of these different boxes as well. Right. But there's a number of things here with Okafor that ended up seeing him not become what people hoped he would when he went 3rd overall.
So there's a lot to unpack with a guy like Jahlil Okafor. And I think the evolution of the game is the place where we ought to start. He was exactly who I had in mind when I brought that up just before the commercial break. This idea of the Golden State Warriors embracing going super, super small and essentially benching Andrew Bogut and David Lee, and just leaning into space in order to beat those LeBron-led Cleveland teams. It changed the game in such a way over the next decade that I think we have to trace it back kind of to that moment. Yes, there are influences beforehand. I think the Spoelstra Heatles teams were always well spaced. Mike D'Antoni's offenses in Phoenix led to this 3-point revolution in some regard.
But people thought that you couldn't win a title playing the way D'Antoni did in 2015. Like that was a real narrative out there.
That is right. And Golden State was the first to shatter it. And if you look at the subsequent years and the way that roster construction worked at the NBA, look at James Harden's Houston Rockets teams and the way that they were essentially built to space the floor, shoot a ton of threes, but also have guys like PJ Tucker who can move to that small ball 5 and match with a Golden State team in a pinch if you needed to. So the game of basketball changed a lot right around the time that Okafor was being evaluated and being drafted. And quite frankly, there's probably a week to 2 week long period between when the Warriors started to go to that so-called death lineup and be super small to win that title and when Okafor was actually drafted. Really small window there. Philly as a team, like, correct me if I'm wrong here, Sam, they drafted 3 bigs in the lottery 3 consecutive years. Nerlens
They did.
Noel, then Joel Embiid, then Jahlil Okafor. And there were injury issues and there were guys on court, but that's a really tough combination. To see the league trending smaller and be a team that has just drafted 3 big men who are pretty much locked into playing the 5. So how do you split those developmental reps? How do you go through it with all of those guys when I think early on it was pretty clearly established Embiid had the best chance of turning into the man. Nerlens Noel can be a great defender. Jahlil Okafor can be more of a back to the basket scorer. Unfortunately, that just wasn't valued in the way that it was a decade prior. And I think so much of where Jahlil's miss in some regard came from is a little bit outside of his control. He might not have done everything perfect that was in his control, but so much of this is trends to me.
A lot of it's trends. I mean, look, like the 76ers, if I remember correctly, they had to like assign like a security guard to like accompany Okafor. Yeah, so I'm looking at a report here from Chris Broussard in 2015. Had to like assign a security guard to like be with him when he was out because of, according to Broussard, a few embarrassing and potentially dangerous off-court incidents with Okafor, right? So I think that we can, say that probably played a factor here in some way, right?
Yep.
His body developed more quickly than everybody too. Like he was big from the time he was, basically like a freshman and sophomore in high school. And I just like don't think that. I think that becomes a hard evaluation as well. Being that big that early, just obviously he's going to be great at Duke, and obviously he was incredible, throughout the course of his high school career. But obviously you can also say like you could see the cracks. Like I still remember Angel Rodriguez absolutely slicing him in February, maybe January of his freshman season at Duke, in ball screens, and Miami like upsetting that team. And it was incredibly fun to watch, and also was probably a pretty big red flag. At the end of the day.
Well, it's a challenge when you're younger and you are so physically dominant to not rest your laurels upon that dominance. You need to continue to develop skill, and you need to continue to develop for the moment when you're facing guys who are just as physically dominant as you. And getting those reps at a young age is really difficult to do. But man, I always worry about guys who just are so physically dominant, but don't necessarily show the skill or the adaptability at different levels when they are challenged.
The next one I want to talk about is Mario Hezonja, because I like really, this is one that I really struggle with. Okay. The Okafor one is like kind of obvious. I'm pretty sure that like Hezonja just like, I think he was probably a little bit overrated as an athlete in terms of the functionality of his athleticism and how it translated to the NBA. Incredible open court athlete, not a great like half court athlete with like a great first step and super flexible hips and everything like that. I think that maybe that ended up causing an issue for him once he got to the NBA, especially on defense. He was just not a very good defender. His feel on defense was quite poor. I just like, yeah, that was a weird one. Cause like he's even gone on, like been like a pretty effective player in EuroLeague at this point. Like, he's played EuroLeague the last 3 years, like 2021, 22, like he averaged like 15 points a game in EuroLeague and like was pretty effective. He played for Real last year and was like, again, a pretty effective player in like a bit of a more limited role. Like there was, that's one that I just can't totally figure out why, like he didn't at least stick in the NBA as like a spot shooter. Right.
Yeah, it's tough for me because I wasn't doing a ton of evals back then. No access to clips or synergy. I wasn't in the draft analyst business, but great 2K player. Like that guy could get hot in a hurry in 2K.
Yeah. I mean, look, like he said to Basket News in April 2022 that like he didn't get the respect that he felt like he deserved. and B, that he didn't like the style of play in the NBA and that the NBA is more of a show than like basketball itself. So maybe he just like didn't like fuck with the style in the NBA kind of. And for European players, like that adjustment from a more European style of basketball, where Mario Hezonja, like if you know him pre-draft, like he came up through the Barcelona system, was like, you know, a very, very, very high end player, like from the time he was like 15, 16 onward. And maybe that adjustment was just a little bit too hard for him. Sometimes that will happen, obviously. I also, if I remember correctly, I do think there was like was there a turnover situation there in terms of the front office as well, if I remember correctly?
I'm trying to remember if he got in there, because I know Orlando had been in the mid to 2010s, kind of a turnstile of head coaches in some regard. Was that around the year, or was that a little after when Skiles came back for 1 year?
It's a great question, but if Hezonja felt that way, Scott Skiles would not have gone super well with him. So yeah, Skiles was 2015-16, and
that
then
was
Frank
his rookie
Vogel
year.
the next year was his rookie year. So I think probably a lot went against Mario Hezonja at the end of the day to try and make him an NBA player. And that's a shame. It's a shame on some level, but there were also flaws. Like, let's not pretend Mario was like a perfect player when he was in the NBA, but he's one that like, I look back and like, I'm a little bit surprised that he didn't stick. Like he ended up not being quite the shooter that is what people anticipated from the NBA line. Like he was a career 32% 3-point shooter. And that was basically what he was over the course of his last 3 years as well in the NBA. His best year, he averaged 9.6 points and shot 34% from three and averaged 4 rebounds and, had a barely above, 1-to-1 assist to turnover ratio. So even at his best, like it probably was just like a slight misevaluation on the athleticism. It was probably a slight misevaluation on the shot. And, it just didn't work for him. Yeah. And he's one though, that like, it surprises me that he didn't stick as a rotation player.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine being a rookie having to come in and learn a new style of basketball playing for Scott Skiles. That's a tough ask.
Next up, Emmanuel Mudiay is a fun one because I think that he is a very good example of my skip steps and skip experience corollary. 6'4" point guard, like had a great physical frame, had the ability to really get guys on his hip. Like the thing that I remember is him playing with Nikola Jokic at Hoop Summit 1 year, where it was really hard to stop those two in pick and roll actions. Mudiay never had like great explosiveness. I think that was probably a little bit overrated, but he was a guy that like seemingly had this great feel for ball screens. I think that as he moved up levels, it became clear that it was harder for him because he just didn't have that like innate passing ability that he needed at the highest levels. Like he was pretty good with Denver as a passer. He wasn't great at it given what his lack of explosiveness was and his lack of shooting was as well early in his career. Like he needed to be an elite rim pressure guy and an elite passer. And he was like a pretty good passer. But I think that where we see the skip step stuff is he goes to Prime Prep in Dallas in high school for his final season. I have skepticism on what that was and what that was like. Ends up committing to SMU. Decides to not go to SMU, goes to China to play in the CBA. Plays just 10 games in the CBA. Played like in the playoffs in the CBA or whatever. In total, played 12, averaged like 18, 6 and 6, and was like pretty valuable for the most part. but it just never felt like he got the necessary reps to me. Because when he got to the NBA, it felt like things were moving fast for him as like a point guard that was going to have to live off of feel in a real way.
Yeah.
And then he has like a couple injuries. Like I think his second year, like he had like a weird, like interrupted second year kind of thing where it was a bit of a struggle. Then he gets traded, if I remember correctly, plays like a decreasing number of games every year for his first 4 years, and then gets the like revival year in New York where he was pretty good in 2019, where it was like, okay, no, this is like kind of, this might be a thing. And then he signs with Utah and then like doesn't really get the chance. He's one where I think the skip steps thing kind of hurt him because, as Dirty Dancer says, another Stanley Johnson type, he developed physically at a really high level early.
Yeah.
He was like 6'3", 200 pounds, like very early in his high school career, and could keep guys like on his hip all the time. And he didn't develop at the rate with his skill level that he needed to. Once you have those advantages, the key is to keep developing your skill level to be able to maintain those advantages even once they're gone.
Right.
And to be able to create those advantages once your physical advantages are no longer present. And that just didn't really happen with him, unfortunately.
Yeah. And, I think, I don't remember watching Mudiay play a lot pre-draft, but if I remember times in Denver in some regard, early on in his career, there were, I think, ample opportunities for him to kind of earn his way and get minutes and be kind of a piece for them. And he couldn't find that right feel or that ability to kind of fit into a system with others. Does that sound what you remember of his time in Denver?
A little bit. They also drafted Jamal Murray pretty quickly right after, and it became clear that Jamal was their point guard of the future. So that becomes, a factor as well. You get drafted over and you don't get as many developmental reps in the ways that you need them. It was tricky. It was tricky with Emmanuel. But he had like the weird revival season in New York where he averaged like 15 points and was like pretty effective. And you just wonder why it didn't totally work out for him as like a backup point guard, but maybe it just wasn't meant to be.
Yeah.
But I think the skill level just never quite continued along that developmental trajectory after the physical, gifts weren't quite as there, where he didn't have the physical advantages of being bigger and stronger than guys. The next one is 2016. We'll get into 2016 now. The first one I want to talk about is Dragan Bender. I think this was just a pure misevaluation.
Yeah.
I don't think there is any other way to put this. I think people just completely missed this. I get it. And look, like I say, this is someone that like was doing draft work then. And I think I was stupid for thinking that Dragan Bender was going to be an NBA player.
Yeah.
Like, this is a guy like, and he did really well to like, I think kind of hide it throughout the course of like his pre-draft year. Like he played like 7 EuroLeague games.
Yep.
He sat out, if I remember correctly, the youth tournament that he was supposed to play in the year before his draft because of like a disagreement with the shoe company. Like Croatia was supposed to play in like a certain brand of shoes, but he was signed to like a different shoe company. So he wasn't able to play like in the youth competition. So Dragan Bender ended up like not getting to play there, ended up like not getting to play a ton with Maccabi. And he was kind of drafted as like, I don't want to say a man of mystery because he was so well publicized. Like he'd made an all tournament team when he was, I think like in the U16s or U17s, if I remember correctly. So NBA scouts had seen him and stuff, but like the last year, like he kind of was like not around a ton. Like he didn't play a ton of minutes that final year with Maccabi Tel Aviv, and the Sun still took him highly. And I think it was just a misevaluation at the end of the day.
Yeah, in some regard, I think that's true. It's funny looking back anecdotally. Like I had a college teammate. I held his fucking water bottle for 3 years. But who ended up going and playing professionally in Israel and worked out a lot with Bender. And as he and I were staying in touch, all he would tell me was how good this kid looks in workouts and how skilled he is in different areas. Like that stuff, I don't know if it's the Darko Milicic effect coming back. Like when you work out with guys and you can see the skill and the things pop off the page, it is very different than being great in a 5-on-5 setting. It's very, very different. And a lot of times if we base an eval off of what guys look at in a 1-on-0 gym or in a workout or, smaller based settings like that, it just really raises red flags for me about, you have a much higher chance of getting this wrong.
Yeah. And like, even going back, like part of the thing that one thing that we didn't talk about in the intro is I think people often can put, and I do this too, like I'm not going to sit here and absolve myself. Like I do this way too regularly. They can put an emphasis on defensive traits above being able to fucking play, and just being able to play basketball offensively at a high level, especially in today's NBA where like you have to be able to play on offense.
Yes.
Just straight up. If you can't play on offense, you are just such a detriment to your team that it's really hard to have you out there. You need to be like an elite defender, not just like a good defender. You need to be like Matisse Thybulle out there, just wreaking havoc for everybody. And even the Sixers realized that it was a little bit hard to play Matisse at times.
Yep.
So with Bender, one of the ideas was like he's this like very instinctive, smart defender, and I think people over-indexed the idea of him being 7 foot and like maybe being able to shoot at some point.
Yeah.
Another kind of thing that I think we do with a lot of these like bigger guys, right, is we say, "Oh, this guy's a great shooter for a 7-footer," right? Well, like a great shooter for a 7-footer is, can you make like 32% of your threes or like 31% of your threes? It's still not good enough to like make that many threes in the NBA. Like you're still not going to get that opportunity in the NBA because you're not good enough at it, right? You have to be actually good at stuff to get a chance to make those reps happen in the NBA. You can't just be theoretically good at it. You have to showcase it in practicality that you can be good at it. And I think that Dragan Bender was a theoretical prospect across the board.
So, Sam, let me ask you this question because it's at that point is making me think a little bit about other parts. How many misses do you think come in the evaluation world based on trying to find the next version of a currently good or valuable player, right?
A ton. Yeah.
Like,
but like, what is the next version of Dragan Bender? Like, what is Dragan Bender the next version of is kind of my question, right?
Maybe Porzingis. Like maybe there's this idea that here's this big 7-footer who could. I know he's so much better, and he was so much. Well,
he's so much bigger more than anything.
Was. But
like that was it.
To me, that's what this comes from. Like how much of it is seeing a new type of player that comes through and saying, I want to find another version of that because it's going to be valuable in this league if we can find that type of production and match it. And so oftentimes guys get miscast or drafted way above the position they should be based on that thought alone.
Yeah. I mean, look, like that's a whole chapter in the Undoing Project, the Michael Lewis book that Daryl Morey took part in. And one thing that Daryl Morey says is like after Stephen Curry got drafted, you saw an influx of these high-level shooters, that looked like Stephen Curry, that were 6'3" and like had very similar physical traits to Stephen Curry. Like frankly, like I think he even brings up that like had a very similar skin tone to Stephen Curry. Like you saw statistically an uptick in those players getting drafted because of the Stephen Curry effect. So it's really interesting across the board, right? Really, really, really interesting, I think, in that way. Yeah. I think that the trying to find the next guy is the next X player is real.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's unfortunate for these guys because that Dragan Bender would have nothing to do with something like that of trying to be the next
Totally.
Porzingis. He's just trying to be the best version of himself, and unfortunately, that is where you try to fit guys into boxes where they don't belong. I know you'd put it earlier; they're put in the wrong role, or their skill set is just miscast for what an NBA team uses them for. A lot of times, that comes to trying to replicate the version of somebody else that's good elsewhere.
Yep. The good news for Dragan Bender is that because he was misevaluated, he made $15 million in the NBA.
Sure. Good for him.
So that always helps. That definitely always helps. The next one is Kris Dunn. This is one where like Kris Dunn had a great close to the year this year. I don't even know that like I want to call Kris Dunn like a total disappointment. Maybe this is just me thinking that he's a slight disappointment because I adored Kris Dunn pre-draft. Yeah. I thought he was a dude. The problem was Kris Dunn like didn't really have a tight enough handle and like was so much stronger and athletically gifted compared to college players that once he got to the NBA, he couldn't really quite maintain that advantage offensively because he didn't have the skill level commensurate with being able to maintain his advantages once that advantage went away offensively. But I mean, you saw it on defense and you still see it on defense. Like he's still like kind of he's still an impactful player on defense. Like he played late in the season with the Jazz. I don't know. Like I'm still holding out hope that Kris Dunn can do something in the NBA. But I mean, look, it's fair to say he didn't live up to what people hoped of him, right?
He's drafted top 5, and I think it's fair to say he has not delivered top 5 value in that regard. Like some part of this, I think the handle is an interesting part of the evaluation. Like you just look at the shooting numbers that he's undergone in his career. That's a huge part of it. Didn't really shoot his first couple of years at Providence, played a little bit more sparingly. And then by his junior and senior years, 35% his junior year, 37% from 3 his senior year, both on really good volume. And then he gets to the NBA and just looking at his first couple of years in the league, 28.8%, 32.1, 35.4, then back down to 25.9. Like at some point, the results are really what you get judged by. So I don't know if there was something in his shot that could have been evaluated differently or led people astray, but you draft on this upward trajectory of, as you mentioned earlier, continual growth over his 4 years in school, got better as a shooter in a way that really would have solidified his offensive game and made him well-rounded. Then he gets to the league, and that's kind of the missing link.
Yeah, and look, like Kris Dunn, another injury guy, but like the thing is that we knew that like he was an injury guy coming into college. Like he had that shoulder surgery in his second year of college, if I remember correctly, where like he missed the whole year almost. And I think that like he missed a bunch of time with the Bulls one year. Like he missed some time, like almost like coming into I can't remember if it was rookie or second season. I might have like broke a hand or broke a finger or something like that. Like there was like he got interrupted with like little injuries. And I think like accumulation of little injuries can sometimes hurt your developmental trajectory. It's the amount of time that you can spend developing your craft and developing your skill set in his case. So I think it was.
Uh-oh. Did we lose you here, Sam?
But he had a number of different factors, and hopefully he's finding a home now in Utah. Like he played 25 minutes a game and like was really, I thought he was like really quite good late in the year last year. Really, really, really awesome. Like defensively, like he averaged, I think he was up over like 10 points a game even as well. Like he was really, really good late for Utah. I'm hoping that, we're at the point where he can kind of come through a little bit on the promise of what his defensive skill set is mixed with some offensive playmaking ability. I will also say this again, like I think that we oftentimes can overrate like defensive energy players with as opposed at the expense of skill level. And skill is where the NBA is going at this point. And we could say that's a combination of what you said, where evolution of the NBA matters in a real substantial way here. And it's really hard to be unskilled in the NBA now. Not to say Chriss is totally unskilled, but he's probably not as skilled as other NBA players are at the point guard position, and relies more on athleticism, length, strength, everything that comes with that, size as well. And it's hard. All of these things are coming together at once to stop players sometimes.
Yeah. Well, Sam, there's one player in the 2016 class that I just got to ask you about as an evaluator. Marquese Chriss. What happened here?
I had him like in the 20s, I think. Like that was just like a high draft pick to me. I thought that was like that's the Marquese Chriss Papagiannis draft, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Where that was just like a multiple like weird situation. And like Marquese was pretty okay that first year for what he was. But yeah, no, I never really got it totally. Like he was kind of a surprise one and done guy after, I think he, what was it? It was like 12-5 or something at Washington, but it was like highlights all the time. I thought he was like kind of a highlight guy more than anything. Cause like he played like on a Washington team with DeJounte Murray, where DeJounte was like very clearly the best player.
Yeah.
And also was just like, that team was like terrible on defense, despite the fact that they had DeJounte. Like I didn't really get the Marquese Chriss thing, I guess. So like, that's not one that like I guess that he would be a disappointment, but I don't know. I think that's just a weird one.
Yeah, that's a reach or a miseval in some way. Because like part of me thinks, super athletic, 6'9" guy who in theory shoots threes in college. Like those are the guys that you're throwing the dart at the dartboard at if you're trying to look at where the NBA evolution is going, right? So I don't know if that's an appropriate thing to do in the lottery. I certainly don't think so. But I wasn't really big into the eval space at that point. And Marquese Chriss has always stood out as a super fascinating one to me. Like, what did he show to earn that designation?
Oh, he could jump out of the gym.
Yeah.
Like he was like a crazy athlete. But I think that like this goes back to one thing that we haven't really brought up specifically with some prospects yet. Like he was always a project. Like even when he was drafted, like he was drafted as a project. And I know he started, a bunch of games his freshman or his rookie year in the NBA, but like no matter what, his first year, he was seen as a project. And I think that like he's a great example of you have to keep up. And when you come in the NBA, it's such a deficit. Like, I don't even know if he made like all Pac-12 his freshman year at Washington. Like it did not like play on like a great team at Washington and like may not have been an all conference player. It was just such a bet on tools that when you're coming into the NBA at a level lower than everybody else, the hope is that you're going to increase your skill set like exponentially over the course of the next few years, because as you say, development is not linear. And like, he was just one where like it didn't come. And I think it was just never really a great bet personally. But I think that that's more what happened with Chriss.
Sure. So another thing when talking about those high ceiling or those project-y type of draft picks, I think that we at least have to acknowledge here how much usage of the G League has changed over the last decade.
Totally.
As a developmental tool, as how many teams just even have one now, where we're at the point where a couple of years from now, every franchise in the NBA will have their own G League affiliate. That is changing a lot about how these guys can get those reps back, can continue to work on their game. And I think we've seen that's a tried and true method for developing guys into legitimate NBA players and rotational guys down the line. But as we're
Mhm.
talking 2015, 2016 here, that's still a little bit taboo. That's not something that a lot of these teams are utilizing as frequently for some of their top draft picks,
Yeah.
or guys are even open to that type of route when they get drafted. So I think that has had a real a change in what we've seen over the last decade.
I think that's a really good call too. I think that's a really good call. Let's go to 2017 now.
Okay.
The first one here is just Josh Jackson. Like, why did Josh Jackson fail? Developed earlier athletically than everybody else, and like very clearly had off court concerns. That from, if I remember correctly, there was a incident at Kansas where he kicked a car of a woman that was like dating somebody that was like on the team or something. Like, it was like a weird incident, and like may have gotten suspended for that. And then, there was the Rolling Loud incident, and then there was the incident at the what was it? James Jones had to like show up at a like autograph signing or something at a local grocery store because Josh Jackson like didn't. And then now over the weekend there was a report that he's in the midst of a civil suit for a sexual assault. So I think with Josh Jackson we can kind of like chalk all of this up to just like there are some off court concerns.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Let's see here. Next is Frank Ntilikina is the other one I wanted to talk about here. And this is like just a number. There are like,
oh yeah, this is almost every box.
There are so many boxes here. I will say this. And people are going to think I'm like probably a little bit aggressive on this. I want to start here. In general, with European players, I really prefer at this point to see them be highly, highly, highly productive before drafting them. The guys that have tended to be successful are either A, super toolsy guys that like are centers, right? Clint Capella is like a good example of this. Or Rudy Gobert. Rudy Gobert was like pretty good though in France his pre-draft year. Frank Ntilikina like played real minutes. Like he played 20 minutes a night for a French league team and averaged like 5 points and 1.5 assists and like was supposed to be a point guard. And I think was probably, again, just kind of misevaluated. I think if you're going to be a good player coming out of Europe, the odds are pretty likely that you're going to be a good, you're going to be a productive player in Europe if you're going to be a good player in the NBA.
Yeah, I think that's fair. A lot of coaching turnover during his early seasons in New York as well.
Front office turnover as well.
Front office turnover. We can check a lot of those boxes. I think the misevaluation one is part of it. I think he was probably pretty raw from a skill and feel standpoint. Like you said, hadn't produced in high volume at the top levels in Europe. Those guys tend to need a little bit longer of a time. But as we talk about a lot of the guards here, I'm starting to notice a little bit of a trend in some regard, which is this idea of feel. And you and I talk about this a lot, but I think the guys who are prone to, I don't want to say the phrase falling out of favor, but falling out of favor sooner with an NBA team are those who don't provide that exceptional feel right out of the gate.
It's like feel and skill as well.
Yeah.
Like
it buys you time to keep developing the rest of your game in some regard. If you can show flashes of that are more sustainable.
Yeah. Like a lot of these guys are not great athletes that grew early that, Ntilikina 6'5", we're going to get to Killian Hayes 6'5", Kris Dunn 6'3", 6'4", Emmanuel Mudiay 6'3", 6'4", like these bigger guys that aren't great athletes that, in many cases are really good defensively, like Ntilikina and Dunn. I think we're probably recognizing here in a lot of ways that You can't overvalue potential defensive value, and you can't overvalue the early developers at size.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, at the point guard position, you really need an exceptional skill level more than anything else.
Yep, totally agree. Particularly, I can't emphasize this enough for first round picks. Like, expectations are going to be high for you, and you've got 2 to 3.5 years to really prove that you deserve a second contract or belong in that organization long term. Like, you don't have as much time as we like to think these guys do to play through some of those field concerns if they're having them.
Yeah, I think that's one where, like, look, I probably had Frank at like, I would guess like 10 or 11 that year.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard one. And then, like, look, like Dennis Smith is probably one that people will consider a disappointment. Yep. Dennis Smith got hurt. Like, that was a big factor with Dennis Smith. Like, he tore his ACL after, right? And now that he's not quite what he was athletically, he's adjusted, and he was literally one of the 5 best defensive point guards in the NBA. I guess that it is a disappointment in some respect, but like, it's a disappointment based on like a very fundamental injury that changed the trajectory of his career. And
team fit too, with how they drafted after him, bringing in a guy like Luka Doncic. That changes what you need a Dennis Smith Jr. for.
And then afterward, he gets traded to a new team as well. Like, Dennis Smith had everything kind of thrown at him in the early portion of his career. Lonzo obviously gets hurt. The Markelle Fultz stuff, obviously he had like the thoracic outlet syndrome, and he's become a good player. Lonzo's been a really good player when he's been out there. I get that some of these guys are probably disappointing to the teams that drafted them, but I don't really even want to talk about them in the same way that we talk about Josh and Ntilikina, because like, I think Ntilikina was just a miss. I don't know how that, I don't think that would happen in the current draft ecosystem. Like, I do not think teams would be this high on a 6'5" point guard that started most games for his team in France and averaged 5 points and 1.5 assists. I know he played like off ball and was next to a point guard, but like, the odds are that if you're playing off ball in France, it's probably for a reason in some respect. I get it that he won like the Euro MVP and everything like that, but it seemed pretty clear even that, like, during his pre-draft year, that like the shooting was not quite what people thought the shooting was.
Yeah, that's fair. You're not describing Killian Hayes there?
Not describing Killian Hayes.
Okay,
we will get to Killian momentarily. Let's get to 2018.
Ooh.
Marvin Bagley was just like an early developer athletically, and never developed the skill level. He was just one that like never got, he didn't keep up in terms of the skill level improvement that he needed to.
Yeah, in some regard, I also think that if I want to talk about trends in the NBA for a little bit, that was right around the time we started to see these non-shooting 4-5 tweeners kind of lose their spot in some regard, that teams are starting to favor stretch shooting, and maybe guys who are a little bit smaller than Bagley at like 6'7", 6'8", the Jay Crowders of the world, who can bulk up and play that same position at the 4. There are a combination of factors. I think most of it is Bagley just not having the skill level he needed to thrive in the modern NBA, but there is a little bit of positional phasing out going on for what Bagley brought to the table.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good point. I think that's a really, really good point, that like the requirements of the position changed. Also, I think that like the processing and like feel for the game stuff changed from an evaluation perspective over the course of the last 3 years, maybe, is like a good way to put it, right? I think we do a better job of evaluating that now than what we used to.
Yeah, this was the first real draft class I got into pretty heavily. Bagley wasn't a top 10 guy for me in some regard. I never loved the process of how he played at Duke, and I was a huge Duke fan. I tried to watch as many of those games as I could, but I mean, his raw talent was off the charts as a one-and-done prospect.
Yeah, I had him, I think, third behind Ayton and Luka. and just thought that it would work on some level, but it just didn't.
Yeah.
Like I thought the natural talent would just take over, and like it, I thought he'd improve, but he just never improved. Yeah, it just didn't happen. But again, another reclassification guy as well.
Well, I had my big miss in 2018 with Mo Bamba. That was a guy I was super high on.
Yeah, not one that looked like probably had Mo at like 7 or 8, some 8 or 9, something like that. But what made you so excited about Mo?
This was copycat syndrome for me in looking at how Rudy Gobert was dominating the NBA. And drop coverage big, great shot blocker, size and length, and good instincts. I thought Bamba had a lot more offensive upside to that. And maybe this was me getting into AAU basketball and having a little bit less of a well-rounded picture of how skilled all of these guys really are. But I remember watching him handle the ball and shoot threes and be able to do different things. Anecdotally, I watched him, I think it was the Texas-Kansas game right around the holidays between Christmas and New Year's, when he absolutely dominated the Jayhawks. And like I kind of fell in love with him. And as I've gotten better at this and spent more time being thorough and using everything as a data point, not just falling in love with those that I first get attached to, I've I think become more disciplined in letting myself be taken astray by somebody who just flashes that much potential and saying, that's it, I'm sold. But that's kind of what it was for me with Bamba. Like I so badly wanted him to be Rudy Gobert that shoots threes that I let that overtake the rest of the evaluation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a totally fair way to put it. And I think that like just getting, having guys that like fall into boxes is easy, right? Trying to think anybody else here. Anybody else? I mean, Kevin Knox, like I think people just misevaluate Kevin Knox's athleticism.
Sure.
18 years old, people bought like super young, super, potential to shoot, came off of a bunch of movement at Kentucky, playing within that scheme and showcased the ability to move and shoot at 6'8", 6'9", whatever he was at the time, and loved that. Just didn't like, I never bought the hip flexibility. I think I had him at like 13 or 14 that year because I was just like, oh, I don't know what this is totally.
Yeah, he's a bowling ball. I just remember him running people over, and like at some point,
well, everything's in a straight line. Like he has no shiftiness.
That's right. At some point, you need a little bit more skill and like navigation and traffic to be able to make it as a slashing wing who doesn't have like the most reliable jump shot.
Yeah. That was one that I didn't totally get at the time. Let's go to 2019. Okay. Jarrett Culver is a fun one. I think. I liked Culver. I did not love Culver as much as everybody else did. Like I remember pre-draft, like he was the one that this was when like the draft Twitter community seemingly became like a bit overwhelming in a big way. And the draft Twitter community fucking loved Jarrett Culver. And I liked him. I think I had him 6 that year, if I remember correctly. Like there were a lot of people that had him 2 that year, 2 or 3, like behind Ja or like even ahead of Ja, depending on the situation. I didn't get that at all.
No.
I didn't get that at all. I had him like in a totally different tier.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. Like I think that what happened with Jarrett was like he kind of in his sophomore year, he really learned how to shoot, it felt like. And then in between his sophomore year and like rookie year in the NBA, I think that there were some changes to the shot that like didn't totally work. Just mechanically looking at it. So yeah, it's interesting. He's one that I think was tough.
I think a lot of this is over-indexing winning in some regard. That year in 2019, I feel like
the Malachi effect, baby, the Penny Malachi effect.
Maybe not quite to that regard, where it's like just one small run. Like that was a year everybody was seemingly falling in love with Texas Tech and Chris Beard and that kind of team and style of play. And you're looking for someone to become the hero of that. And I think Culver kind of became that guy in some regard. I still had him a top 10, pick or eval on my own board that year. I had him 8th overall, but man, there's just so much of this comes down to whether you can shoot and whether you don't shoot at the NBA level.
Yeah.
Like that, he showed feel. I think he still has feel. He showed length and defensive ability. I think he probably still has those. But man, if you're going to scale down to that off-ball roll, like the shot has to go in. It just has to. And maybe where the eval missed on a guy like Culver was overdoing it on what he was able to create off the bounce. I don't think he.
I think people just bet on shooting first and foremost.
Yeah.
Like it's not always that guys are just going to learn to shoot in the NBA. And second, you're right. Like I think that people over-indexed on the shot creation he showed at Texas Tech,
Yes.
where like the offense was like super movement heavy and involved like a lot of different players and a lot of different, like I was there at that Final Four. Like I saw it. Like it was.
Me too. Yeah.
I didn't get it, I guess, at the time.
Hey, we were at the same game. I didn't realize that. That's pretty neat.
We were. That's right.
We were. How about that?
Who knows? Like maybe TMNT is right. Like, maybe he does a little better under a different organization. That organization's goals pretty rapidly changed throughout the course of his tenure there. So it's always possible.
Yeah. And like this feels very Kris Dunn like to me. A little bit over-indexed on the defense. Wasn't as good of a shot creator with the ball in his hands as we may have thought. And the shot just didn't fall where we got, I don't want to say fooled by the upward trajectory of multiple years in college, but he wasn't that legitimate of a shooter to have that become his hang your hat on it skill to see minutes in the NBA.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's a good call. Okay. You wanted to talk a little bit about Cam Reddish. I mean, is this one where it's just like over-indexing the idea of the talent when in reality, like hasn't ever there was a year in Atlanta where I thought he was actually like pretty good because he really defended at a high level.
Yeah.
And shot it reasonably well that year. But the sum is not the result is not the sum of the tools with Cam Reddish, maybe is a way to put it.
Well, the reason I wanted to bring him up is really to ask you because I don't know what to make of this whole thing. Like I still see a lot of those tools in the upside and the unique skill stuff. Like I don't know if he is an eval miss in some regard, and the fact that he just hasn't really put it all together. And in some regard, do we learn from a guy like a Kris Dunn who maybe evolves over time? And maybe it is just a feel. I thought he had pretty good feel when he was younger and at Westtown and showed a couple of flashes at Duke and playing like the third or fourth fiddle within their offense because that was a year when they had Zion, they had RJ Barrett, they had Jones essentially running the point.
Yeah.
Like where does he come into play there? And
so he did play off the ball. So like the adjustment, we can't say it's that.
Right. But I thought there was a bet on feel that he showed like at Westtown and in the
let's hold on him. Let's hold him for a minute because there was a question that got dropped in the comments that we're gonna not finish with, but answer here momentarily. Sure. And that's an interesting one. Yeah. Let's go to 2020. Okay. Killian Hayes. So I had Killian Hayes like at 11 or something that year. He wasn't like a top 10 player for me. I think I might even had him like 14 or something. Like I did not totally buy that. Yeah. He's fine. Like I think people way over index the ability to separate. And that's just not who he is. He can't separate.
Yep. Big guard does not equal better. You have to still be able to generate paint touches and rim pressure. And to me, that's
without a ball screen. That's the thing. Like you can't always do it only when you have a ball screen. You have to be able to do it without a ball screen sometimes. He needs a ball screen every single time. I think that is also a running theme of some of the things we're seeing. Emmanuel Mudiay needed a ball screen every time. Going back through, Kris Dunn could actually separate off of isolation, which might be why he's stuck around a little bit in the NBA. Continuing to be like a higher level athlete than a lot of these guys. I wonder if that's like a potential factor.
Well, and then, with Killian, so much of this, we've had overlaps with this before of he's probably not good enough to do everything with the ball in his hands, but he's certainly not a proven enough spot up shooter. So that leaves you in this position where you don't really check either box as a guard that you would need to be on the floor. Pistons go out and draft Cade Cunningham. How do you fit next to a guy like that within the offense in some regard? Like, that's the Dennis Smith Jr. thing of your role is drastically changed or different than the one that you thought you might have. Like, it's a challenge.
The other thing about Killian is, like, I feel like people melted down about him making a couple of late game threes in his pre-draft year in being like, quote unquote, like clutch, when in reality, he shot 29% from three in his pre-draft year and like has never been, he was 31% in the year before his pre-draft year. He's 25 at the U17 World Cup. He was 25.8 at the 2017 U16 Euro Championships. Killian Hayes has never been able to shoot. And I think people over-indexed on the idea of him, oh, well, it looks okay, and he made these late game shots, and it was just like a way over-index on what the skill set was. He can really pass, and like I think that he does know how to really play with a ball screen, but I think people way over-indexed on the wrong things.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's fair in retrospect in a lot of regards. I also think that at that time, it's easy to get wrapped up in big for his position, pretty good feel, maybe developing as a shooter is the glass half full way to look at some of that. Like, there are defensive tools, and he almost looks like one of those, if the shot falls, what are you really missing type of pre-draft prospects. So like, I still get it in theory in some regard, but yeah, like,
but he's never shot. Like, that's the thing that we do all the time. Like, oh, like that's he'll shoot at some point. Well, no, like especially for point guards have to be able to shoot on the move at high speeds off of the pull up. Like, you have to be able to do so many different things. Like, it's not just, we need to get this guy where he's developing a catch and shoot opportunity, which is a lot easier than developing a point guard being a threat off the bounce in pull up situations. So yeah, that was never one that I totally got into. Okay. The next one here that I want to mention, I just want to briefly mention Obi Toppin. I want to see like the situation with Toppin. I want to see him with the Pacers and all that stuff. I am fascinated. I will say, like, I wonder if we over-indexed on him being like the best athlete in college basketball last year, and then as he caught up, it was a little harder for him.
Yeah, he's a great athlete who I never thought he could sit down in a stance. Like, there's something about his hips and his lower body that never really sat as super athletic to me. Maybe a different circumstance in Indiana here is the best one for him. Like, I look at the way he was deployed this past year with the Knicks, and like, I don't think Obi Toppin, whose selling point was his athleticism and kind of versatility in the pick and roll or pick and pop game, like, don't camp him in the corner and have him be a catch and shoot guy. I'm glad he's found decent value in doing that, but he's got to be used differently in some regard.
The last guy here that I want to talk about quickly is Isaac Okoro. Well, we need to talk about another guy too, but Isaac Okoro is another one, like, just never shot it. He's been really good on defense, and he's been able to stick as a role player, and I think he probably will stick as a role player, which is why, like, I don't totally want to spend time on him, but like, needs to shoot at the end of the day. That's the key.
Yeah, 16th on my board. I never really got it with a guy like Okoro.
Yeah,
I never got it. For a 3-and-D guy who doesn't really shoot the ball well, I struggled to see where his offensive role was going to come in. Like, people wanted to talk about passing and playmaking and some of these flashes that he showed, but like, what is he going to do to have the ball in his hands at the next level? Like, I just never saw the vision for what his role would ask of him.
Yeah, I fucked that up. That was on me. Yeah, I had him at like 5th or 6th or so. I had him in Halliburton, like right next to each other. Yeah, I can't, 5th or 6th is where I had him.
Tough day at the office.
Yeah. the last guy's Wiseman. And we talked a lot about like, his issues. Didn't get a lot of reps, didn't get the reps at Memphis, sat the year with Golden State, had some injury stuff that came up. Feel for the game stuff, I think, was just like a misevaluation. To me, it's just like the total like lack of experience to develop before being thrown into high leverage situation.
Wiseman's just always going to be so tough. Like injuries and the lack of availability at a time when your development absolutely calls for it is pretty brutal. That we see that be what knocks a lot of these guys off their even if they can regain their athleticism, it still knocks them off their trajectory pretty cleanly.
Yeah. He just, I think, probably never really. I watched him get absolutely obliterated by Oscar Tshiebwe, playing in Southern California, I think in his season before his senior year at Memphis East. And I was just like, oh man, this guy is like not it. And then I kind of came around, like he's one that I wouldn't fuck up on again, I think pretty clearly. One thing that I want to talk about quickly here, we've talked about a lot of point guards.
Yep.
And it seems like where the misses occur most are these bigger bodied, like defensively valuable in theory, guys who struggle athletically and like maybe struggle with shooting. Why do we think this became such an archetype across the NBA? Because like you look at the best point guards in the league, right? It's, I'm like trying to think through like Ja Morant, Chris Paul, Darius Garland, Damian Lillard, like Van Vliet. I have like the assist, like most assists up right now.
Steph.
Jamal Murray, Mike Conley, De'Aaron Fox, Stephen Curry.
Drew.
Drew Holiday is another one certainly. Trae Young. God, I almost forgot Trae Young. Why? Jalen Brunson, another one, certainly. Like, if we're forgetting your point guard, I'm not doing it purposely. I'm just like listing a lot of really good point guards to make a point here. Very few of these guys are like this archetype of player.
Yep.
And that scares me for Anthony Black.
No.
Because he ticks a lot of these boxes, man.
His feel is off the charts in comparison.
Way better than most of these guys.
Any of these guys that we've talked about. And that to me is the floor raiser, is your feel and your adaptability. Like elite character, elite feel for the game. He's bigger than a lot of, like we're talking about 6'4"-ish guards, 6'3", like what Culver maybe 6'5". Like Black is 6'7" and long and can defend up and down. There's so much more versatility to a guy like him. I'm going to push back on that because he's my baby.
Yeah. And like Josh Giddey is like a prime example of the hope for this kind of archetype, right? He's like more that, but he's not Josh's size. Like Josh is like 6'9", like he's 6'7". Like there's difference. I'm trying to think of like examples where this fits. Like DeJounte, I guess, is an example. I mean, Drew, I guess, would kind of be an example here, right?
In some regard, he's maximized his offensive ability over the last decade. Like I think he's improved from where he was early in his career to such an extent that he's closer to joining that first group.
I remember like the Killian Hayes like idea was like, can he be like a James Harden? Was a thing that got brought up. I mean, look, it was stupid. I did not say this. I'm just saying that like that was the idea, right?
You mean one of the best shooters we've ever seen?
Correct. So that's I guess you could say that, like tank 6'4", 6'5" body type, right? Derek White's a good example, like bigger bodied point guard that can do some stuff. But it doesn't feel like a lot of the best point guards in the league tick this archetype. So is there a chance that we're just overvaluing it, like across the board?
Probably so. I think if we overvalue it, it's almost more in terms of draft position than it is anything else. Like, I still think that Derek White's and Marcus Smart's are incredibly valuable to have on your roster in today's NBA, but I don't think that you should draft them trying to make that person a top 3 offensive option or giving them the keys to an offense. Like, that's where the onus has to come in on whoever the evaluator, the front office executive, and the coaching staff are, to be aligned on what they're going to ask of this person.
Okay, so I want to go back to a question that Jordan Handelman asked earlier. Shout out to Jordan, who's thrown some really awesome questions into the YouTube comments here. What players that you misevaluated do you think you would miss on again if you scouted them today? And I think this is a fucking awesome question, and this is why I wanted to save Cam Reddish.
I
think I would just miss.
Yeah, I did too. Yeah.
I think I would just miss. Big wing. Maybe like I would be a little bit lower because of the shooting. Like the shooting was not awesome at Duke, but man, he was high volume at Duke too. Like, I think Reddish is a good example. Like, what players that I misevaluated would I miss on if I did this again? I think I would probably miss on him.
Yeah. It's a good one. That's a good one. I probably wouldn't have Mo Bamba in the high esteem that I had him in, but I would still be drooling over the upside in some regard. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Like I wouldn't have like Bagley particularly high. I wouldn't have, I didn't have Knox super high. I mean, like maybe Hezonja, like again, like bigger wing, but like again, like was okay for Barcelona pre-draft, so I wouldn't miss on him because
I know we're not going this recent here. We want the cutoff of 2020 because we've seen these guys play for long enough where we get a better feel. Like I think we still got to be optimistic about what these 2021, 22 draft picks can turn into. Would you change anything on Jalen Suggs?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I would. Feel out of ball screens and shooting. Yes. Yeah. I had Jalen too high. I've thought about Jalen quite a bit. I still really like Jalen and still would take him like over Jonathan Kuminga, for instance. Like I'm more than happy with that. So I'd still have him like top 6, but yes, there are things I would change.
So I see Jalen Suggs' trajectory now as being closer to a Marcus Smart or a Derek White. Like that's who he should be and needs to be. And in that vein, I don't know if you want to draft a guy like that in the top 5, 6, 7, 8 in a normal draft class year in some regard. Yeah, that's going to be a tough one for me because I love Jalen Suggs.
I'm trying to think of like other players that I'm trying to think of like more answers to this question, like guys that I would miss on again.
I'll say Usman Garuba in 2021 because I just buy the feel in the defense, and I still think he just hasn't found the right team to utilize him.
I had him in the lottery, so I would probably given how much more important I think offense is in the NBA, I probably would have him more like top 20, but I would still have him probably top 20, which is frankly, given what he's shown this year, probably still a miss. Or given like what he's shown at this point of his career. Jabari Parker is one that I would probably miss on again. Jabari obviously had the knee injury that like completely cratered him in a real way in 2017. Like people don't remember that in 2017, he was averaging like 26 and 3 and shooting 49, 37, 75 and was like well on pace to being really good. But that's like the kind of player that bigger wing, shot creator, real shooting touch, but probably was not as athletic as I'd hoped. Like that's one that I would probably miss on again, I think.
Yeah, and like, look, we could play that game with like a Markelle Fultz or someone like that too. Like, it's just
I would, well, yeah, again, like I would miss on Markelle again. Like I would
yeah,
have that guy ranked number one.
yeah,
Given what we saw at Washington, I'd have him ranked number one.
yeah.
And I loved, I had Jason Tatum higher than like anybody that year. Like truly. Jordan Handelman brings up Dalen Terry. That's again
Yes.
another one that I think I would probably miss on. Again, big wings. Like I will miss on big wings.
Pour one out for my guy Jalen Suggs. I love Jalen Suggs.
I will give you the floor on this one. Gregory Castillo says, I'm still swinging on Bamba Miller. Adam Spinella, are you still swinging on Bamba Miller? Your guy.
I have 3 swings and misses until I strike out. I'm 0-1 right now. So I'm stepping up to the plate, looking like that thing is fat, and I'm going to hit it out of the park. No doubt about it.
I love it. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to see if there are any other questions that we got here. I thought that one on like guys that you would misevaluate still was really good. Really, really, really good.
Yeah, this has been a really fun conversation because we have arrived at newer archetypes of players for me to look out for that I should be a little more cautious about falling in love with, because either their archetype doesn't always fit in the NBA, or there is just not a strong enough track record of success of guys showing what they show at a younger age. Ooh.
Yeah, Jordan Handelman brings up, would Jan Veseley have been good if Jan would have came over later? People often ask this, like, would Veseley have figured it out if he'd have come over 5 years later? Because if he would have been 5 years younger, let's say, not come over 5 years later, because Jan went on to become one of the best players in Europe, like unequivocally, but B, also like theoretically had something of a skill set that could translate to the NBA. The thing that Jan never did that I think he really would have needed was shoot from 3. He didn't go toward shooting from 3. He actually just like completely got rid of it from his game in Europe. Like he doesn't take them really. So I think that it would have been a little bit more difficult without him being able to shoot. For him to make it work, because in Europe, I think he is, like, for his size, a great enough athlete to like be a great player. But yeah, I don't think so. I think that he's one that people like build up in their mind a little bit, and I still don't know if it would have worked. I think that like he had the career he was supposed to have probably, and made a bunch of money in the NBA for being the 6th overall pick, and then made a bunch of money in Europe being one of the, probably at his peak, one of the 5 best players in Europe.
Yeah. I think that he would have maybe gotten additional chances to stick around longer had he waited 5 years, just because he fits better in theory in different spots across the league. But I think the lack of shooting kind of caught up to him in some regard.
And then here's another good one from Jordan Handelman. Should we value Shaedon Sharpe more because he seems to be overcoming that missed year? We talked about throughout the podcast, the idea of skipping steps, reclassifying, everything like that. I think yes, a little bit.
Yes.
The feel is still not there, which is the problem of all of this. Like, but it's a little bit there. It's more than I expected to be there, I think is a good way to put it.
I really am drinking the Shaedon Sharpe Kool-Aid right now. Like I'm super high on this kid.
Yeah. This is a really good question as well. From Basketball Genesis, people were very high on Kendall Brown in the first 2 weeks of college basketball, like say top 5 to 7 on boards. Do you think overreacting on someone like that is easy? The other one in that draft was Trevor Keels. People way overreacted to Trevor Keels, I thought, pre-draft or like early in the season.
Yeah.
Yes, you just can't get tied to your evaluation at the end of the day. And I think too many people do. Like like people had Trevor Keels as like a first round pick, even at the end of the season. And I think I ended up with him at like 40 on my board. I think I ended up with Kendall Brown at like 38, 37, somewhere like late 30s. I had him, mid to late 30s. You just can't get tied to it at the end of the day.
Nope.
It's the key. Like, just be very flexible. Like, have like another thing that I always talk about that is a Daryl Morey-ism that he took from, I think, Philip Tetlock and Super Forecasting, which is a great book that I've read as well. Strong opinions weakly held, where you have very strong beliefs, you go to bat for your beliefs, you can explain them, you really are able to continue down the road of having a case for it and being able to explain why this belief is your belief. But when the information changes, then you change. You change on a whim, right? And part of the problem with that, in some respect, having a very public facing job like I do and like Adam does, is that players see this and families of players see this. And if I list a guy at like 5 on my board, that guy's probably going to go pro after that year, frankly. Like, unless I am completely out to lunch and I'm the only one doing it, like, that guy's probably going to see that information and he's probably going to be like, oh yeah, I should go. Like, I should go pro. And that piece of it is where you have to be very, in my position, especially, very conservative, little c conservative, in what you write and in what you're putting out into the public sphere. And I'm always just very cognizant of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Basketball Genesis is hinting at here is this idea of anchoring bias. That the first time you see somebody, you develop a really strong opinion of them and you over-index towards that opinion. It is something that all evaluators have to be cognizant of and worry about. That's why I always try to remind myself as I'm watching film or going through guys, everything is a data point. It's not the data point. It's not the most important aspect about him. Everything combines and comes to form your evaluation on somebody.
Yep, I think that is correct. Adam, this was great. I had a great time doing this. Shout out Alex Eddy, long time listener of the show.
The man with 2 first names.
Did you rank Bam at 27?
I don't remember.
I definitely didn't. I had him at
I don't think I did rankings back then. And if I did,
I think I had him at like 19 or so.
No, I had him at 20, but I wasn't doing full-time evals then.
Yeah, I think I had him at like 19 or 20. Yeah, and that was before I'd gotten like some real feedback on like how much he fucking obliterated workouts that year, and he did. He absolutely destroyed them in like such a substantial way. Let me go back and look to see where I had him while we're talking.
Yeah, I had him at 20.
Let's see. That even before I don't even know if I wasn't even at the Athletic then. I don't even know if I was doing this. Like, I was doing it full time. Yeah, I had him at 20, it looks like. So yeah. No. Yeah, I don't know who you're referring to there. You feel like, look, pre-draft, like there were teams at like, 18 that were doing homework on Bam, thinking there was a chance he was going to get there. So yeah, I don't know what that's about. Seasons and Sloan wants a quick word on the USA team being beaten by Cade and Jalen Duren. I'm going to make James Edwards come on the pod at some point, either this week or next week, and talk about the Detroit Pistons and Cade. Yeah. But quick word, I wouldn't read too much into the select team beating the USA team. As Steve Kerr, it's a rite of passage every year. Having said that, like, the fact that Cade is a real dude should have Pistons fans very excited. And Jalen Duren, like, Jalen got spoon-fed by Cade. Like, it was totally a stud.
I love Cade Cunningham so much. This is just warming my heart right now. I love it.
Yeah, Cade is going to be a monster. I'm
Yes.
all in on him. Like I've seen no
Yes.
reason to not be. But I'll have James on maybe later in the week to talk about the Pistons, because someone else actually asked me. Someone else actually asked me about doing the Pistons in a YouTube comment. So yeah, I want to make sure and do the Pistons at some point soon.
Nice.
Okay,
Nice.
Adam, tell the people where they can find your work.
Yeah, find me on Elon Musk's new pet project at the Boxing One _ my YouTube channel, Adam Spinella, my name, or Substack, theboxingone.substack.com. I'm doing a deep dive into some mid-major prospects who I sneakily kind of like coming into the year, or at least I'm very intrigued by. Some of them will be hopefully gracing NBA draft boards this coming season. Others might need multiple years, but at the very least, just trying to shine a light on a couple players who don't always get that at the college level and see, hey, is this anything here? It's, as Sam and I talked about at the very beginning, me abusing my synergy privileges and just watching way too much film that probably doesn't mean anything.
I love it. Adam, go follow his work. He's the best. I have a top 60 board coming tomorrow. It is actually coming tomorrow. It is filed. Everything is ready to go. We're going to be there. You're going to get to see my rankings. I'm super excited for you to see them. They're a mess, truly. This 2024 NBA draft class is a total mess. I have like a group of 5 guys I think you could reasonably rank number 1 right now. Yeah, like that's where I'll leave it, I guess I would say.
Ooh, I can't wait.
Awesome. Keep it locked there. Keep it locked on the show. I will have a couple more podcasts this week. Until next time, we will talk soon. Bye.